A few months ago, Rabbi Nolan Leibovitz, senior rabbi at Valley Beth Shalom, gave a compelling message that I want to begin my sermon with this morning. He shared the following. Rabbi Leibovitz grew up with 4 grandparents that survived the Shoah, that survived the Holocaust. And after they moved to the States, after several years, when they would encounter other European immigrants, usually there was this kind of exchange. His grandparents would say, "Oh, where are you from?" And the strangers would say, "I'm from Poland," or "I'm from Czechoslovakia." And his grandparents would say, "You are? Well, we're also from Poland, and we're also from Czechoslovakia." And then Rabbi Leibovitz, as a young boy, would lower his head because he knew exactly what was about to come next. His grandfather would look right into the eyes of the strangers and say, "I only have one more question. What did your family do during the years of 1939 to 1945? And Rabbi Leibovitz explains that at first the strangers would be stunned by the question. And then they would quickly follow with, no, you got it all wrong. We were the good guys." And his grandparents would say, "Okay." Rabbi Leibovitz uses this example, his grandparents' actions, as inspiration as to how he will choose to respond in the future to protesters that have been spewing anti-Semitism on college campuses, to the protesters currently wreaking havoc and destruction in Washington, D.C. He says perhaps in 3 to 5 years, if these are students, they'll graduate and they'll be looking for a job. And it could be one of us on the other side of that table interviewing them. And we should say, really aligned with the words of his grandfather, just one question. "Oh, that's so interesting. You graduated during the years 2024 and 2025, during those great protests that wreaked havoc on our college campuses and really swelled Jewish hate in this country. I'm just curious, where were you?" And their answers, their actions, their reputation should determine, at the very least, whether or not they get a second interview. Now, I bring all of this to your attention because I truly believe, no matter which situation I'm speaking about, actions must have consequences. And the reputation that we cultivate through our actions, it's often the most precious asset we possess. Rabbi Shimon in Pirkei Avot teaches that there are 3 crowns: the crown of Torah, the crown of royalty, and the crown of priesthood, but the crown of a Keter Shem Tov, the crown of a good name, that surpasses them all. There's a midrash that explains that the reason why a Keter Shem Tov, a good name, is so elevated is because even when Bnei Yisrael would travel with the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark in which our holy tablets were encased, you can imagine that the Ark was right in front of them, right before their eyes, and it would usually travel with them for the duration of 3 days. But a person with a good name, whether or not that person is right before your very eyes, a person's reputation, if it's a good one, although I will argue in a second, a bad one too, that can travel from one end of the earth to the next. And we know this too well today, because all you have to do is look at TikTok or Facebook or Instagram. I often share with our B'nai Mitzvah students that they have it so much harder than we ever did. Because anytime they make a mistake, or if there is something that they put out on the internet that they wish wasn't there, we know how difficult it is to erase. But I also make sure to tell them that when they put something good out into the world, that's also recorded there too. In our sessions with our students, we speak about both the difficult and fulfilling responsibility of being a Jew. That in carrying the name Yisrael, we know that our actions certainly impact our individual lives. But we have to realize that our actions also have the power to change the course for future generations. Because all we have to do is look at what we read in the Torah this morning. We read about Zelophehad's daughters. Now, Zelophehad dies, and in this particular Torah reading, what we see is the portioning out of land when they reach the promised land. And what the daughters realize is Zelophehad has no sons. And in the census, only men are counted, and so only men will inherit the land. And so the daughters decide, we have to do something bold, we have to do something courageous, and so they decide to go up to Moses and petition for their inheritance of the land, specifically because Zelophehad had no sons. They are the ones that are left. And it is fascinating what happens. Moses consults God, and God and Moses, they say yes. And in doing so, the results not only change their lives, but the results change the lives of Jewish women for thousands of years to come. Because Jewish property laws were initially based on the very Torah reading that we read this morning, on the very choices that Zelophehad's daughters made during biblical times. A story that surpasses time and space and reminds each and every one of us sitting here this morning that the actions that we take reach far beyond the confines of our own timeline, and our current actions add or detracts from the lives of those that come after. I want you to listen to the story of Rabbi Moshe Chaim Lau, Rabbi of Netanya. You see, one day he receives a phone call from a very persistent woman who says, "You have to be the rabbi that officiates at my wedding." And Rabbi Lau says, "Look, I don't know." And she's like, "Well, let me tell you exactly. Maybe I'll be able to convince you. Let me tell you exactly when the wedding is. The wedding is the night before Passover." He says, "That's a terrible case for me to come to your wedding. Do you know what I do as a rabbi the night before Passover? I sell all the chametz. I'm answering all of the halakha, all the halachic questions about Pesach. I'm getting things ready for the Seder." He says, "That's a terrible, terrible date to ask me for." But she didn't care. She continued to call week after week after week, nudging, and he said at some point, "Listen, lady, why me?" She said, "Listen, you have a really good reputation." And he kept thinking, come on, I live in Netanya, it'll take time for me to prepare, there's no way I'm gonna get there on time, but for some reason, he was drawn to this wedding. So he says yes, and he's sitting with the bride's grandfather before the wedding begins. And the bride's grandfather begins to ask him, "So, Rabbi, where are you from?" "Netanya," he replies. And he says to the grandfather, "Well, where are you from?" And the grandfather replies, "Pietrikov." Well, now Rabbi Moshe Chaim is shocked because that's the town where his family is from. And the grandfather proceeds to ask the rabbi, "Do you know the last couple that was to be married there before the Jews were all killed off in Pietrikov?" And Rabbi Lau shook his head. The grandfather said, "It was my wife and me. It was 1942. And do you know who married us? It was the rabbi of Pietrikov, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Lau. Have you ever heard of him?" And with tears running down his face, Rabbi Lau looked at him and said, "He was my Zaidi. That was my grandfather. My name is Moshe Chaim Lau. You know, I didn't really know why your granddaughter wanted me to officiate at her wedding. All she told me was that I had a good reputation. But now I know why I'm here. Because I'm my grandfather's namesake. I'm here to marry off your granddaughter. And now where my grandfather left off, I take over. The storyteller that brought this poignant anecdote, Rabbi Y.Y. Jacobson, relays that when he heard this story, he thought it captured the lifeline, the essence of Jewish history, where our grandparents left off, we take over, and then we pass it on. You see, at first this week, I thought I was preparing a sermon about how to establish and maintain a good reputation, and I think you'll agree with me that that's just part of it. Our current actions impact future professions, which doors may open or close for us, but it's not merely about our reputation. Rather, I believe that we must ask ourselves today, what is my legacy? And will I take bold, holy, righteous step forward so that one day someone will look at my story and say to themselves, that's the story that I choose to pass on. Why do we think so carefully about what we name our children? Often in the Sephardic tradition, we name for the living. In the Ashkenazic, we name for the deceased. But the reasoning in determining a child's name is the same. We hope that child will carry on the attributes of the person for which they're named, that the ancestors will inspire the descendants. Now, if you look back in the Torah reading, Zelophehad's daughters are delineated by each of their names. They're not just called Benot Zelophehad, but they're named Machla, Noah, Chogla, Milka, Tirzah. I think to remind us, each and every one of us can make a difference on our own accord. Each daughter was just as responsible for the people's lives they didn't know, but they would ultimately change. Which leaves us to understand that we are placed in this world not only to establish a Shem Tov, a good name, in this lifetime, but to also ensure that our current actions earn the pride of those that will come after. May each of us create a legacy in which our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren will say with conviction, it was their story, and it was their name that I chose to pass on. Shabbat Shalom. We continue in our service with Ein Kelohenu.